So, without further ado, I'm going to start by welcoming everybody to our sixth, is it the sixth? The sixth 9 in 9 UDL webinar, uh, brought to you by Goodwin University Institute for Learning Innovation, our Center for Teaching Excellence, and the University of Bridgeport, a Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. University of Bridgeport is our, I guess we could say, sister, brother, institution of higher education. Today, I am privileged, absolutely privileged, to bring to you Sarah Silverman. She's an independent contractor, also happens to adjunct here at Goodwin University. We're thrilled to have her. She has spoken with our faculty in the School of Applied Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, where I'm the dean, and I didn't introduce myself. I'm Diana LaRocco. I'm the dean of the School of Applied Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at Goodwin University. For those of you that are unaware, we are recording this session. We will post the link once it's all set to the session recording in Padlet. There you can find the other sessions that we've had up till now, including any slides that our wonderful presenters have been willing to share. We will be monitoring the chat, so please use the chat, and again, share where you're from. We're happy to have so many people from around, I guess I could say we have Canada, from other countries around the world, really happy. And let me tell you a little bit about today's session. Sarah will be specifically talking about UDL action and expression, the expression and communication guideline. And she's going to focus on principles of neurodiversity and how they relate to and overlap with universal design for learning. I've previewed her presentation, and it's going to be quite engaging. As I said earlier, Sarah is a consultant, a speaker. If you've never had her come to your institution, you should have her. She is wonderful, talking about disability and about neurodiversity. And she has a great blog, and it knows a lot about technology. And we are just absolutely thrilled to have her here today. She's also designing courses for us at Goodwin. So we're very lucky to have, how would I say it, Sarah? Come across you somehow in the universe. So welcome, Sarah, and I'm going to stop my screen share and go ahead and let you take over.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Diana, for the very warm welcome. I am going to share my screen so that we can get to slides. Welcome, everybody. Title of this talk is Learning from Neurodiversity, Options for Expression and Communication. We are going to have a participation method today through the Poll Everywhere app. You can open that, and I suggest doing it on your phone if you have a mobile device and that works for you to use, because you can use emoji in addition to text, which is a cool form of communication, I think. But if you want to do it on your computer, that's also fine too. A question may pop up right when you open, but you don't need to answer that now. That's just how the app works. It was kind of an introduction question that we'll get to in a second. So again, thank you to Diana and the whole Goodwin and UB team for inviting me to talk to you all today. I'm excited to learn with you. I have a little bit of access information that I wanted to just note up front. The slides I'm using are available at tinyurl.com/9in9slides. The 9 is the numeral 9. And there's a handout with references and resources available at tinyurl.com/9in9handout. Again, the 9s are numerals. Feel free to turn on captions if that's something you need, and feel free to use your time and space however you want, meaning your camera can be on or off, you can move around, etc. Nothing that you do will cause me any bother. And I just want to also, I've been starting to note this a little bit more because I do a lot of webinars. I want to recognize that a webinar might not be the best learning mode for everyone. If that's you, I do thank you for coming, even though this isn't maybe your preferred mode. And I wanted to encourage you to use the slides and the handout after the program today, and feel free to follow up with me if you have any questions. This doesn't all have to happen within the hour that we're going to be together today, though I am very excited for the hour that we do have to spend today. Since we are talking about expression and communication, I wanted to just note a few of the ways that you can communicate today. So one is the Zoom chat. I'll do my absolute best to monitor it. And there's also some of the hosts of the series who can help me monitor it. I hope that's not overstepping. There's the Poll Everywhere polls. And that can be text or emoji, but emoji only works if you're using a mobile device. I just wanted to note that. You can raise your hand and speak at designated times. I have one designated time later on in the presentation and one at the very end that I'll try to make time if people would like to raise their hand and speak, or contact me after the session. That's totally fine as well. The goals for our session today are to consider why and how neurodiversity and UDL are overlapping yet distinct frameworks. We're going to review the ways that the neurodiversity movement has an investment in the UDL guideline, provide options for expression and communication. So we're going to look at that guideline and think about why neurodiversity advocates have had an investment in making this possible. We're going to also brainstorm methods of expression and communication that can be used in a learning context. And then we're going to name and also troubleshoot some challenges that can arise when students are using multiple ways to communicate in learning. About me, a little bit different than what Diana introduced. Some things I like to say. My name is Sarah, I use she, her pronouns. My description is a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair, but I never wear my hair down, so you can't tell. Today, I'm wearing a striped white and gray shirt, and my background shows a kind of empty room. I'll tell you a bit more about what room I'm in a second. I wear a lot of hats. I teach disability studies. I do instructional design and faculty development, and I also do some consulting on neurodiversity in higher education. I have a personal connection to neurodiversity, being autistic myself. And I've kind of been a UDL practitioner pretty much since I started teaching. It was in one of my first grad school seminars on how to teach, and I heard about UDL, and I was like, all right, I'm sold. This is for me. Where I am at this exact moment right now, I thought had some interesting overlaps with our topic today. So I'm visiting the Elon University Center for Engaged Learning. That's in Elon, North Carolina. Side note, my spouse's first name is Elon, but with an A instead of an O. So I figure I have to get him some sort of t-shirt or something, but then I'll just take a Sharpie and replace the O with an A, and then that will be perfect. But anyway, I'm participating in a research program on affirming and inclusive engaged learning for neurodivergent students. So the group here at Elon is hoping to establish a kind of whole research agenda on inclusion of neurodivergent students in college life. There's been some research is increasing, and they're trying to really kind of accelerate the amount of research that's being done at this topic. And it's going to go for 3 years. So I think I'm coming back here for 2 more years. So if you're interested in that program and more about the Center for Engaged Learning, they do a lot of interesting research. I put a link in the handout. I would love to learn a little bit more about you. Diana invited you already to share your names and locations, but in the poll everywhere, I'll also give you an opportunity to share anything else about yourself that you would like to, and just a word or two about what brought you to our session today, if that is something that you would be open to sharing. I'll give everyone just one more second on this page to use the QR code or the link, and then I'm going to go over to the responses page. Hi, Christopher. Oh, New England College. Is that in Springfield, Massachusetts? I think that in maybe somewhere else. Life University. What an interesting name. I don't think I know Life University, but I like the name. Remotely. Okay. Hi, Hafa. I think that's how you pronounce your name. And from Trumbull, Connecticut. You're making me miss Connecticut. I live in New Haven, Connecticut, and I want to go back. I've been away for a bit. Hi, Shane. Thanks for introducing yourself.
Sarah, there's a message that the poll is full. We received the maximum number of responses, so.
Oh, interesting. Wow. Okay. That's new to me. That can happen. Maybe it's the size of this group.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what we'll do. Welcome, Linda, as well. For the next couple of polls, maybe I can ask everyone to just do one response. And although it's difficult to control exactly, if you participated in this one, maybe take a break for the next one and we can alternate. Or if you want to try entering your response into the chat as well, we can monitor both. But I enjoyed seeing some of these motivations. It seems quite a few people are interested in neurodiversity, interested in the overlaps with UDL, and then a couple other people are actually just looking for ideas about what are multiple ways that students can express themselves and communicate. So I hope that we'll get to all of those motivations.
So Sarah, really quickly, people can also put their responses in the chat instead of in poll everywhere.
Yeah.
And Tom Tobin, thank you, Tom. Yes, if you're using the free version, it's limited to you said 45, Tom. I thought it was 50, but anyways, it's you have a limited number of responses.
Let's go with if the responses are full, go to chat. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. So where are we in the guidelines? This image shows the UDL guidelines grid that some of you may be familiar with multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression going from left to right. We are in the second box down on the right in providing options for expression and communication. I just want to show this to situate you if you're familiar with the UDL guidelines. If you're not, I recommend going to the CAS website and taking a look at this organizational style. It's something that you'll see a lot if you work with UDL. It's worth just getting to know the arrangement and what you'll be looking at a lot of the time if you work with UDL. Okay, so I have some little artifacts to share. So I have noticed an interesting and welcome trend. Welcome to me. The word neurodiversity has begun to show up in UDL artifacts from around higher ed. So I took a couple screenshots of different sites that I was just able to find through Google. This was from North Carolina State University, and it's a screenshot of a webpage that says, a universal design for learning approach to supporting neurodiverse students. It's a news article from like their campus news service, and they're reporting on some faculty activities. This is another screenshot. It comes from the University of Wisconsin Eau Claire, and the title says CETL, that usually stands for Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, Neurodiversity and UDL in Course Design. It's a blog post. It's introducing the UDL framework, and it shows the kind of CAST-approved images of multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. Again, it's from a teaching and learning website at University of Wisconsin Eau Claire. One more. This one comes from the University of Nebraska, Kearney. I think that's how you pronounce it. The title says, Using UDL to Support Students Who Are Neurodiverse. I won't go into it. I just made a note about how I don't totally endorse the language that's used here, but I just wanted to show you an example of how people are using UDL and neurodiversity kind of in the same breath. So I think overall, this is a very welcome trend. I study neurodiversity and the history of neurodiversity, and I've always been very interested in how to specifically define neurodiversity in associated terms, the history of where it came from, and I'm also very interested in the history of UDL. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is, how did these two terms come to be used together? To some people, it may seem obvious that neurodiversity and UDL are very well aligned. But to some people, it may be less obvious depending on your familiarity with both concepts. So I hope to try to clarify a little bit of this in the beginning part of the webinar today, and then we'll do some activities applying a little bit of what we learned. This slide on the left shows an image of the front of the book, Teaching Every Student in the Digital Age, Universal Design for Learning. It is kind of the foundational UDL text, the first book that was marketed to the teaching community introducing the UDL framework by David Rose and Ann Meyer, and it came out in 2002. Neurodiversity, the word, entered the public conversation around 1999 or 2000, depending on which specific instance you're talking about. I've read this book cover to cover. Neurodiversity does not appear in this book at all. And that's not definitive proof of anything, but I do think it's worth mentioning that these two concepts came about around the same time. And does not seem to me that the original researchers and authors who introduced UDL were necessarily kind of in conversation with the groups that were developing the neurodiversity language. That's just one little starting point. So I wanted to think a little bit about the terms neurodiversity and learner variability. These seem quite similar, and neurodiversity we could define it as the range of differences in individual brain function and behavioral traits regarded as part of normal variation in the human population. And one way to kind of describe what learner variability is in the context of UDL is that because of differences in the brain, people vary in how they learn. Additionally, individual learners vary in how they learn in different contexts. So learner variability has kind of two different dimensions. One is differences between people, and another is variation in the same individual, depending on what contextual factors are active. I wanted to ask all of you, what do you notice about these two definitions? Do you see any similarities, and do you see any differences between them? You can use poll everywhere to respond, and also feel free to use the chat to respond. I am going to keep this slide up for a little bit so that you can look at the two terms. And then in a minute or two, I will go over to the response area. Okay, I'm about to go to the response area, but if you open up the slides, you can go to this slide and look at the definitions if you need to look at them more.
There are some posts in the chat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
The new Zoom didn't show me the red icon, so great. Okay.
Yep. Couple of posts in the chat. And Sarah, if you'd like, either Rob or I could read them, so you don't have to. Rob, do you want to do it? Rob?
Yep, I can. Yep.
Okay,
so we have Tom says good distinction, neurodiversity equals different brains all the time. Learner variability, different brains and learning engagements. And then Aaron also said, I had a similar thought and would add that neurodiversity seems to better capture that identity cannot be separated from learning. Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Also, one from Sylvia too, Sarah. Neurodiversity refers more to physiological, while learner variability describes how the neurophysiological affects the brain related to learning. Yeah.
Great. Okay, and then we have hardware versus input. So I think this person is saying hardware might refer to neurodiversity, input might refer to different inputs during learner, so more the learner variability side. And one other person said definition 1 uses terms normal or normalization of brain function, and definition 2 focus more on differences in learners. Yeah, okay, so I think everybody who is shared has basically captured what I think of as the differences. For some reason, it always takes a little bit longer to move on to the next slide from poll everywhere. Not totally sure why. Why is this happening? Okay, there we go. So I summarized them also that way, that UDL or learner variability tends to focus on learning, and neurodiversity is a little bit more broad. What I also want to introduce is the idea that these come from two different kind of intellectual contexts. So neurodiversity is derived from the autistic community and the autistic rights movement, which kind of became the neurodiversity movement. UDL and learner variability are derived from research on the brain and learning, and they are intended to address the need for design that includes disabled students rather than retroactively accommodates them, and also emphasizes the benefits of some of these design strategies for all students, not just disabled students. So I think that we've correctly captured that they're similar in that they emphasize variability and diversity rather than a norm or a default. And now we're just going to explore a little bit more about where neurodiversity comes from and how that can help us understand the overlaps with UDL. So I'm just going to give you a very brief overview. I talk about this with people all the time, and I've learned that neurodiversity is very prevalent in educational contexts, but not everybody knows all of the terms and their definitions and histories. So I hope this is a good review if you already know that. And if you're hearing it for the first time, I hope this is a good introduction. A working definition of the term neurodiversity might be the range of differences in individual brain function and behavioral traits regarded as part of normal variation in the human population. So the term neurodiversity is sort of just a fact about humans, which is that variation in cognition and behavior exists within the human population. Where it came from, it kind of has multiple points of origin, but it was primarily developed by the online autistic community that developed in the 1990s. The early internet was very good for neurodivergent people meeting each other. A lot of people had been segregated from their peers. A lot of autistic people had no access to community with other autistic people, but the internet provided this. The kind of key point about where neurodiversity, the term, came from is that it was originally used to describe kind of a political position on a biological reality. Biological reality is that there's diversity in how people's brains work. Additionally, that autistic people's brains are different. But the political position is that we don't need to view those differences as disorderly or pathological, that we can accept variation as a normal part of human existence. This is also very closely linked to what's known as the autistic self-advocacy movement, which draws on the legacy of deinstitutionalization in general. In the 70s and 80s, a lot of disabled people used to be segregated from non-disabled people, and they had no support services available to them other than simply living in institutions out of their communities, away from their families. And that kind of gradually came to an end over the latter half of the 20th century. Autistic self-advocacy generally focuses on acceptance and support rather than a cure or the search for a cure for autism. And autistic self-advocates often oppose abusive treatments like shock therapies, many types of behavioral modification therapy. One of the kind of contemporary areas of controversy right now includes whether therapies like ABA, applied behavioral analysis, are ultimately geared towards making a person seem non-autistic for the benefit of the non-autistic population, rather than sort of supporting communication and autonomy. And this is it's a very active debate that is playing out in the community. Not everyone is always so polite to each other in this debate. But so this movement has been led by autistic adults instead of the parents of autistic people. The conversation about autism used to be very controlled by parents of autistic people, and much of autistic self-advocacy aimed to put the leadership in the hands of autistic people themselves. And if you're interested in learning more, the kind of key American organization that does this work is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. One of the intellectual ideas that came out of the neurodiversity movement is this idea of the neurodiversity paradigm, which is kind of a simple statement on what neurodiversity is and why it matters. and it was originally introduced by psychologist Nick Walker. And to paraphrase what this paradigm is, it says that there is no normal or right brain any more than there is a normal or right gender, race, or ethnicity. So the neurodiversity paradigm draws on previous social justice movements that have come about to suggest there isn't a right or a best gender or race or ethnicity. I think that would be completely anathema to us to suggest that there is a right gender, race, or ethnicity. And so neurodiversity draws on this to suggest there isn't also there aren't like a one particular right way of thinking or communicating or behaving. I think this is where we start to understand some of these productive overlaps with UDL. Neurodiversity and UDL share that there is no default way to be. UDL focuses on learning, neurodiversity focuses a little bit more on overall cognition, communication, and behavior. One more note about the neurodiversity movement. This image on the right hand of the screen is the cover of Autistic Community and the Neurodiversity Movement, Stories from the Frontline, edited by Stephen Kapp. This is the book that you want to look into if you want to know more about the neurodiversity movement. It has dozens of firsthand accounts of neurodiversity activists, and I've learned so much from reading this book, so I really highly recommend it. So the neurodiversity movement is basically a social justice movement that seeks civil rights, equality, respect, and full societal inclusion for the neurodivergent. It began with autism rights and self-advocacy, but is now larger and encompasses lots of different what we call neurodivergent experiences or identities. That includes ADHD, learning disabilities, dyslexia, Tourette's, epilepsy, many experiences and disabilities that affect the brain. The movement is not a single organized group, but it's a collection of groups and individuals that do social justice activism using the neurodiversity paradigm. And it's responsible for developing and popularizing terms such as neurotypical and neurodivergent, which have really come into popular conversation a lot more too. I would love to tell you more about the origins of those terms in a different setting. They have very interesting histories. What I want to focus on today is that access to communication, which is part of the UDL guideline we're addressing, is a key concern of the neurodiversity movement. Many neurodivergent people have differences in how they communicate. Some autistic people, as well as other disabled people, may be non-speaking or minimally speaking. Sorry about the typo on the slide. I'll fix it right after. Non-speaking meaning somebody is not able to speak, or minimally speaking meaning that they are sometimes able to speak, or speaking is particularly difficult for them. A lot of texts that have been produced by the neurodiversity movement have prioritized the voices of non-speaking people because people who don't speak are so marginalized within our society. Sometimes spoken language and spoken conversation practically made equivalent with the human experience when there are a number of people who don't use spoken language, not just autistic people, but a lot of deaf people don't use spoken language, and lots of other groups. And I want to also add, like, even for autistic people who can speak, speaking can have a high cognitive burden or be exhausting. And it's possible that other methods of communication may be most appropriate for them. And so if you don't already know what AAC is, I wanted to introduce this concept to all of you. So AAC stands for Assistive and Augmentative Communication. And users of AAC often today use a device such as an iPad or a text-to-speech device to communicate. Though when Diana and I were talking before the webinar, she was mentioning that before computers, people who use AAC would often use paper to show images or point to images or letters to communicate. So technology has changed things a lot, but in general, we're just talking about any alternative method to spoken language as communication. And there's some interesting research that demonstrates AAC provides access to communication where it wouldn't necessarily exist at all otherwise, but also it changes the experience of communication from one of a very, very high burden to one that is easier, more pleasurable, more workable in everyday situations. So one research participant quote from the study I'm citing here, I thought was a great summary of this concept. the research participant said, I was in speech therapy through a segregated special education program until I was 10. My speech was exhausting and didn't feel natural. I did it because it was the only thing people would respond to. It was tiring to speak a lot, and I couldn't access all of the words in my head and make them come out of my mouth. I would have frequent periods where speech would not work or would not work properly. I learned to outwardly appear to speak well because there was a lot of social pressure to do so, but I was frequently being forced to speak when it was difficult. I think this account really enters a lot of the complexity of spoken language or any method of communication that's being seen as the norm or forced, to how it can impact not just the learning environment, but social opportunities, work opportunities. I hope that was kind of a useful example of how somebody who has a limited ability to speak may feel about spoken language. Just a little extra add-on, I wanted to introduce you to some non-speaking activists that I've learned a lot from. One is Hari Srinivasan, who's currently a doctoral student at Vanderbilt. There's an image of him on the right side of the screen. He is a minimally speaking autistic researcher and activist. He was the first non or minimally speaking president of the Neurodiversity student group Spectrum at Cal at UC Berkeley. He graduated from UC Berkeley and is now at Vanderbilt. Jordan Zimmerman is the second person. There's a picture of her on the right side of the screen. She's a staff member at the NORA Project, which is an organization that does disability advocacy. She's a non-speaking woman who has written extensively about how communication with an iPad has enabled her to study, make friends, and advocate for herself. I really highly recommend you go to each of their websites, which I have put on the resource sheet. You can watch some videos of them sharing about some of their experiences. I find them to be very inspiring. I've learned a lot from their work. So just wanted to offer that to all of you. So here's some kind of concluding notes on this section on how to frame the relationship between UDL and neurodiversity. So we've already gone over the foundational theory of UDL kind of does reference neurodiversity, but a little indirectly through this lens of learner variability. It's very similar to neurodiversity, but kind of focuses on the learning environment rather than learning plus social life plus work plus any interaction. I think that the UDL guidelines and any other ways of operationalizing UDL are very aligned with the neurodiversity movement's focus on rights, acceptance, and inclusion for neurodivergent people through the UDL framework's focus on multiple options for engaging or doing any one thing. The UDL guidelines share goals with the neurodiversity paradigm and movement to expect and embrace variability or diversity and challenge the idea of the average or a norm. So I hope that makes sense as a little bit of a summary. Now we're going to go into a little bit of application. Oh, sorry, I did have one more thing to mention. An example, I think, of this overlap is an example from our guideline. Options for expression and communication. One of the checkpoints that you'll find on the CAST website is using multiple media for communication. So I'll just read it out quickly. Unless specific media and materials are critical to the goal, for example, learning to paint with oils or learning to handwrite with calligraphy, these are very, very specific learning goals, it is important to provide alternative media for expression. Such alternatives reduce media-specific barriers to expression among learners with a variety of special needs, but also increase the opportunities for all learners to develop a wide range of expression in a media-rich world. So the media-specific barriers are the exact barriers that have been discussed by neurodiversity activists and non-speaking activists, is that the sole medium of spoken language exists as a huge barrier to communication. But what I also kind of see in here is UDL is bringing into the conversation the idea that many of these, quote, alternative modes of communication that may have been used by people with disabilities more exclusively in the past, perhaps can benefit everyone. Maybe you're not somebody who, strictly speaking, has difficulty with spoken language, but there may be benefits for you, for your learning, for your engagement in a learning community, by exploring alternative methods as well. So we're going to start translating to the learning environment. The first activity that I wanted to invite you to participate in is to simply start brainstorming ways that students express themselves in the classroom. This doesn't need to be in a specific class or space that you teach, but just general ways that a student could express themselves. So if you only teach asynchronous online, you can still include raising your hand to speak basically in this. You can span all of the modalities that you're aware of. And I think that they'll generate a word cloud on Poll Everywhere, but you can also share in the chat. Oh, I apparently have to advance the question. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Again, if you can't access Poll Everywhere, please feel free to write your responses in the chat and we will read them out. Either Rob or I will do that.
Mod added sculpture. That isn't one that I've experienced, but I agree that it definitely could be a mode of expression or communication. And Amy mentioned dance and movement. As the word cloud generates, it seems like a number of people might have shared writing, video, and art, but then there's all sorts of other ones, including presentations, storytelling, tapping, play, books, body, expressions, polls, recording. There's probably over 20 just on the word cloud. And one of the things that I do think is interesting is that writing appears to be one of the more popular ones. Writing is obviously very prevalent in the academic context, and we're kind of entering an age where writing is being increasingly complicated by opportunities with AI, challenges with AI, and so there's actually a part of the whole AI craze, you could call it, that has been leading me to think about alternatives to writing in my classroom if writing with AI isn't part of my goals. So yeah, that's a little bit
There's
of
a few more in the chat, Sarah. I'm
Yeah,
going
thank
to
you.
follow. Yeah, game creation, role play, and then Linda, I like your word cloud pulled apart your words, right? So she was trying to say nonverbal expressions.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay. This generated a cool word cloud. This is also an exercise that I sometimes do when I'm planning an instructional activity, is instead of just saying, okay, you're going to write down your answer and post it on the discussion board, or you're going to raise your hand. While I'm designing, I'll just say, okay, just take a minute and write down as many ways you can think of that someone could express themselves in this activity, just to open my mind a little bit. I think I'm as guilty as anyone as just like reaching for the most obvious to me way of communicating or expressing. And sometimes I have to take a step back and say, okay, well, how many can I name? And then of those, how many might be appropriate or workable in this situation? So this is what an example of an exercise you could do on your own. Okay. Not sure.
Did you see there was somebody in the chat who said it's ironic that we are using only writing to express ourselves on this topic?
Yeah, so we're going to have an opportunity to talk into the microphone in a moment. You can also use emoji, but I do recognize the limitations of this particular medium. 69 people can also be a difficult situation for using a number of methods. But you're right. So I have a little case study here that came from something that actually happened to me. And I thought it would be useful to look at some of the time, like a situation in which you try to plan for a lot of different ways of expressing yourself, but it causes a little bit of friction. So this is a case study. It's also on the handout if you want to read it on there. So Sarah, that's me, is teaching a disability studies course in a face-to-face or on-ground format. She plans an activity to discuss some of the readings on the history of the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I teach a lot about the history of disability diagnoses, and she wants to discuss the following question. How does the story of LGBTQ activists work to have homosexuality removed from the DSM relate to our discussion of the social construction of disability last week? Just to explain this, since you're not in my class, homosexuality used to be a diagnosed condition in the DSM, but activists protested the APA to have it removed. And I was asking students, well, we've discussed how disability is socially constructed and socially mediated. So how do you think about social construction of disability, having just read this history? That's what I wanted to discuss with them. All right, so then she provides the following options for responding. 1, composing a typed response on a shared Padlet. That's an educational tool that Diana actually uses for this series. 2, reading a pre-written response out loud or having someone else read it. 3, speaking a response that was developed in real time. So typical hand raise and talk. And 4, responding asynchronously after the class session. Maybe that's through writing, maybe a video or audio recording, something like that. So I'm curious, what do you think are some potential benefits of offering all of these options? And what could be some potential challenges that you could anticipate? I'm going to move to using chat because I've noticed that Poll Everywhere is having some issues. So let's use chat to respond if you would be willing to do that. Okay, so Julie shared that the benefits are you receive a lot of different ways people are expressing themselves, and challenges time to go through all the responses and grading. Okay. This wasn't actually something I was giving a grade for. It was more just sort of like get students feedback on how they're thinking about the topics, but that makes sense. Susan Marie said benefits. Students have a choice, which probably helps reduce stress and helps them focus. I would hope so. Danny said benefits are students can respond in the way that's most suitable to them. Challenges, there's a lot of opportunities for students to build on each other's responses. Yes, if they're submitting in different formats, right? So say that somebody is responding after the class period instead of in real time. They're not in the same temporal conversation as the other students. Heisling, I hope I've said that right. A challenge is difficulty in all participants engaging with each other, especially for those responding after class, kind of similar. And Tom said a potential challenge is everyone expected to respond? Is it okay to just lurk, listen, or think to oneself? Also, the eager, fast social people will claim space first or exclusively. Yeah. If we see that some people are responding very fast, it may be difficult to kind of say the same response in an asynchronous way after, or take the time to record it and share it with the rest of the class if it feels like it's already been said. So students who respond in the moment may dominate the conversation. Susan Marie said a potential challenge is using time. Speakers will need to wait for people to type. And Anne said benefits. Folks can speak to the concept in a way that's meaningful to them. Challenge, how to have all those modalities cross-populate, right? And so I think part of what Anne might be saying also is, are those all going to be accessible to all of the people who want to read them, depending on the format? Erin shared a benefit is provide multiple options, and challenges consistency in grading. Students may default to one mode of expression. Yes. And Linda is saying students learn that their preferred mode of communication may not be that of another student. And that's also possibly a benefit. Okay, great. And the last challenge from Julia, as a participant, it's hard to keep track of all the different places where responses are going. Do I read? Do I listen? Hard to do them all at once. Yeah. Okay, so I think I'm interested in the challenges personally. It may be because I'm already pretty committed to trying to open up different options. So I think it's best to attempt to come up with some kind of framework or way to anticipate challenges and try to address them or at least understand them. And I'm just going to advance the slides 1 second. I developed a little reflection tool a while ago, and I shared it with you on page 4 of the handout. And one way that I like to think about this is just as we expect learner variability, I think we also have to expect some friction when we invite multiple options for expression and communication. So even in just offering chat and poll everywhere, I saw that there were some areas of friction that I didn't know about ahead of time. And so you can take a look at the tool on the handout. It's on page 4. But the way I kind of have it organized is before an activity where you plan to offer multiple means of expression and communication, you can take some notes on the activity and the relevant details, like the modality and the number of students and the goals. And then kind of like in our word cloud exercise, just jot down a bunch of ways that students can communicate and express themselves in this context. And then also jot down what you think some potential areas of friction might be, and take a moment in advance to see, okay, how do I think I could navigate these, at least the ones that I was able to anticipate. And then a few suggestions for after the activity. Again, you can see the full graphic organizer on the handout, is to reflect on which methods were offered, which ones were actually used, and in what prevalence, any reflections you have, and notes on navigating the friction and lessons for the next class activity. One of the things that I tend to do is just recognize that through prioritizing multiple ways of participating, I just need to build in a lot more time for the flow of a live activity. And that requires like real reflection and conversation. If you have any other stakeholders, like, department chair or co-teachers or whatever, in what you're going to accomplish that day, there's always room for trial and error. And if you have goals that aren't being met when so many different modes of communication are being used, you can use this reflection tool again and try to figure out, okay, are there a way that we can satisfy the needs of the students that we know we have with a smaller range of methods, and kind of just go through a process of being realistic about what needs to be accomplished and how that can fit with multiple ways of expressing oneself. My one closing thought before I move on to a little discussion is that a frequent refrain of people in the neurodiversity movement is that communication is a human right. And actually, many of us, I know some of you who are in this Zoom today, many of us engage the concept of human rights and social justice already in our practice. So I kind of want to bring UDL and neurodiversity in alignment with that. And so, the neurodiversity movement and UDL can really show us how the design of our learning experiences with option for expression and communication help advance not just learning outcomes, but also human rights through this perspective that the neurodiversity movement provides us. If you are interested in reading more about the experiences of non-speaking people, I have 2 books to recommend. One is an anthology called Loud Hands, Autistic People Speaking, and another is called Typed Words, Loud Voices. And both of those anthologies have a number of personal essays from non-speaking people from whom I have learned a lot and changed a lot about how I teach as well. I really enjoyed learning with all of you today. Thank you for your presence and participation, whatever that looked like for you today. You are welcome to consider us friends now and contact me. That's my email address. And you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. And I'm happy to answer any questions or sit back and let you discuss. This is one of the times I had earmarked for people raising their hands and talking in the mic if that's how they'd like to ask a question or make a comment. I'm going to stop sharing.
All right, so Sarah's opening up the conversation. If people want to ask questions, raise your hand and or have comments. Somebody wrote in the chat, did this just fly by or I'm the only one that felt that way? Yeah, it flew by, Aaron. Thank you. I felt that way. So anybody would like to ask Sarah a question, we welcome this opportunity that Sarah's being so generous and open it up for questions or comments or additional information that people might have that would add to the conversation. So Tom said the Zoom reactions feature is turned off. So bravo. Multiple hand clapping. Yes.
For the reaction.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. I don't know if everybody had this experience. I turned on a Zoom today and it updated and there's all new icons too. So Aaron asked the question, Sarah, I'm curious about your thoughts on how some of the critiques of UDL have come up recently.
Yeah. Aaron, would you mind specifying a little bit about like what kind of critiques? I'm aware of a range of critiques. I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You can turn on your mic, yeah.
Aaron, unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, so some of the things that I've heard, and I'm sure there's others too, but just like lack of evidence surrounding like the effectiveness of UDL, implementation on a wide scale, and then also critiques around just the ways in which it maybe doesn't address like other marginalized identities, such as race, etc.
Yeah. I'm happy to share my thoughts. So a recent article that I actually have linked on the resource sheet that is, it begins compassionate pedagogy and involves neurodivergent students. It's by two authors in Frontiers in Psychology. And they make a very interesting comment. They actually summarize this kind of critique of basically the research on the efficacy for student learning outcomes in UDL in higher ed, they name as potentially still in progress. However, they use the term compassionate pedagogy to refer to UDL. So I think there's multiple ways to look at UDL. One is through the evidence base. There's a very strong evidence base of UDL improving certainly the process of learning and the accessibility of learning. And I'm not going to 100% endorse that whole article, but you can see that they give a few references about how the efficacy of UDL, that research is a little bit still in progress. I think there's another way to look at UDL is kind of from a ethical standpoint. I could probably derive the 3 UDL categories just from like, how do I want to treat other people? How do I want to treat my students? It's hard for people to learn if they aren't engaged or motivated. It's hard for them to learn if they can't perceive information. It's hard for them to learn if they can't demonstrate their learning. Those are opportunities I want to make available to my students. So I think if someone came to me and said, I'm dissatisfied with the state of UDL research in some way, I personally am not that dissatisfied with it. But if somebody came to me and said that, I would probably say, well, does UDL also capture something about how you want to treat your students, how you want to build a learning community? If so, then it can also be a useful framework for you. And the critiques about how UDL does not address inclusion, or the critique that UDL might not address inclusion that relates to maybe like race, ethnicity, or gender. It's true that if you look at the UDL guidelines, they don't explicitly address some identity categories that have become important in higher education. I think typically the way I think about that is there's a lot to learn from other pedagogies and other teaching experts and views that address those topics more head on. I'm a huge fan of blending feminist pedagogy and UDL, but also the general idea of UDL is that not all students are the same, and multiple ways of engaging in any different learning activity need to be embraced and celebrated, not just tolerated, but embraced. And I guess in that sense, UDL invites many, many different learners, even if we are not through UDL always naming all the different forms of diversity that may be present. So there's places outside UDL to go that can help us in our teaching in various realms of inclusion. And I think UDL is also a pretty useful framework in general. Let me just check the chat.
A couple people in the chat mentioned 3.0, UDL 3.0, UDL Evolved, which will be coming out soon, fingers crossed. And the intent there was to address the diversity writ large and inclusivity writ large. That's how I would describe it. There's here in the chat a couple of questions. You want to grab them?
Yeah, I see one from Aisling. How do you approach expectations of teaching things like giving oral presentations, especially when they're part of a program learning outcome and important in a career from a UDL lens, and supporting neurodiverse learners? I'll be very honest. I don't ever absolutely require an oral presentation, but if it's part of a career type learning outcome, I'll try to look for different options that address the context that the student may be working in or may be transferring some of their skills to. Another thing that I do try to talk about with my students from a kind of neurodiversity affirming perspective is people have different strengths and different ways of communicating, and a really good idea is to learn to work with other people to take on parts of projects or parts of different activities where you have the ability to express and communicate yourself in ways that work for you, and that they also have, your colleagues also have opportunity to express themselves in ways that work for them. So that might look like there's a period reserved for presentation. One person is speaking the presentation. Another person has spent a lot of time creating a handout that everybody else is looking at during that time. Maybe somebody helps to create the visuals and another person speaks the presentation. So again, there's no silver bullets in any of this. That's just a little bit of what I do. A lot of interesting stuff in the chat. I'm not an expert on the 3.0 guidelines. I'm sorry to say. I know that there's been a major effort to integrate perspectives on like race, ethnicity, and some of the critiques that have come up over the years about the UDL framework. So I encourage you to look at the 3.0 guidelines if you haven't yet. I believe there's a feedback form available on those too if you want to provide feedback.
I think we're just about at time here. So let me thank everybody. And Sarah, there's lots of kudos in the chats, lots of appreciation for what you just presented. I see somebody says unpopular, we need to decastify if UDL is going to address social justice. That's an interesting point. Thank you for that, Anne. All right. So Sarah, we are thrilled to have had your opportunity to listen to you today. It was extremely valuable. Just such a pleasure, so well presented. And, you know, whichever way we could communicate today, whether it was through Poll Everywhere or in the chat, or if people were willing to unmute, it made for an excellent presentation. So thank you so much, everybody. And look for our, let's see, we're in July presentation coming up at the end of July. So thank you, everybody. And I'm sure we'll see many of you again in July. So have a good rest of your day wherever you are. And again, we appreciate your participation.